Venezuela votes to annex part of Guayana, while the Chinese Navy calls out the United States Navy in the South China Sea. Meanwhile, the ceasefire in Gaza has completely broken down and things are escalating off the coast of Yemen. We also have a disturbing report on the IDF's use of AI and how that has led to an increase in civilian casualties. We're going to talk about all of these stories in this edition of the International Affairs News Roundup. On to the first story. Will Venezuela invade Guyana? Venezuelans voted on a referendum on December 3rd to annex the region of Essequibo in Guyana, which accounts for around 60% of its territory. It's also home to a large wealth of natural resources such as oil and rare earth elements. Now, it's unclear how Venezuela plans to enforce this claim, especially after the referendum, and any kind of military enforcement will likely put Venezuela under significant international resistance. For instance, the International Court of Justice warned Venezuela to not alter the current status of Essequibo. All of this being said, the referendum's vote was expected, and the result was expected, but the implications are likely to be minimal. While Brazil has noted the movement of Venezuelan troops to the border of Essequibo and the escalating rhetoric from the Venezuelan government, we might not actually see any kind of invasion, at least we should hope so. Venezuela has found itself completely alone and isolated, with its only real international partners being Russia, China, and Iran. All of them happen to find themselves in their own crises that they're dealing with. Should Venezuela decide to militarily enforce this referendum, no one's coming to save them, and this would likely mark the end of the Maduro regime. And I say all of that to say that autocratic regimes like this are generally more focused on regime stability and survival. Therefore, we're more likely to see this referendum used as a tool to blame the United States and European powers for the conditions in Venezuela, instead of being used to justify an invasion that could threaten the Maduro regime in its entirety. On to the next story. China's military has accused the U.S. Navy warship, the USS Gabriel Giffords, for violating its territorial sovereignty around the Second Thomas Shoal. This is in the South China Sea. This atoll is claimed by China, the Philippines, and more. The Chinese Southern Theater Command sent a vessel to observe the USS Gabriel Giffords. However, the U.S. claims that it was operating in international waters and in accordance with international maritime law. China's claim to virtually the entirety of the South China Sea has increased tensions amongst its neighbors since it started to flex its muscles 10 years ago. And China has made similar claims about other U.S. Navy ships, specifically whenever they traverse the South China Sea or pass through the Taiwan Strait. This follows a very interesting interaction between the Chinese and the U.S. Navy off the coast of Yemen, as well as the summit between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. And while that summit between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden was described as productive, it will likely to take a lot more than just one meeting to de-escalate tensions or solve anything in the South China Sea. So we're more likely to continue to see interactions like this as they've happened for years now, and it's really just kind of a part of how this is played. On to the next story. War has resumed in Gaza. After what I thought was an agreed upon ceasefire extension, which should have taken the ceasefire to Monday, which was yesterday as of the time of this recording, that actually didn't happen. There was a complete breakdown in the ceasefire on Friday, and that has resumed fighting not only in the Gaza Strip, but has actually escalated fighting in other parts of the Middle East, which we'll talk about in a moment. Since the ceasefire breakdown, we've seen the IDF continue to increase its holds within Gaza City and in parts of southern Gaza. The IDF also captured the Supreme Court building within the Gaza Strip and destroyed it. The ceasefire breakdown has also reopened the low-grade conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. The IDF announced a series of evacuation zones, one being in the eastern half of the Gaza City, and the other being in a large swath of area in the southern part of the Gaza Strip around Khan Yunis. The IDF stated that it plans on launching operations in the southern half of the Gaza Strip soon, and these evacuation zones likely mark where the IDF plans on moving its forces, so we're likely to see a large movement into the southern part of the Gaza Strip very soon. Israel has also stated that they will hunt down Hamas leadership anywhere in the world after the war has ended, and that follows an order by Benjamin Netanyahu to Mossad to hunt down the leadership after the war is over as well. The ceasefire breakdown not only impacts fighting in the Gaza Strip, but it also impacts other areas around the Middle East, which leads us to our next story. Things are escalating off of the coast of Yemen. The U.S. Navy reports that 3 commercial ships were struck with anti-ship ballistic missiles off the coast of Yemen, and that the USS Carney was also attacked, and the Houthis have claimed responsibility for all of these attacks. And this all marks a significant escalation from the fighting that we've seen previously. The U.S. has vowed to respond in a proper manner, however, we have yet to see what that response will look like. However, the U.S. did state that they believe that these attacks were fully enabled by Iran. The Navy did say that nobody was killed in these attacks, however, 2 of the ships did suffer light damage, while 1 suffered severe damage and was reportedly at risk of sinking. The USS Carney has had a busy few weeks, responding to a series of Houthi attacks, intercepting ballistic missile and drone attacks on Israel, as well as a series of attacks on commercial commercial ships off the coast of Yemen. Now, why this marks a significant escalation is because the Houthis have previously stuck to hijackings and ship takeovers, but now they're deliberately targeting ships with the intention of sinking them. If there's anything the US Navy takes seriously, it's losing to West Point. Just kidding, it's international maritime trade, and the Gulf of Aden sees a significant portion of international trade going to and from Europe and Asia. Should civilian ships determine that the risk is too high trying to traverse this area, they may opt to take the long way around Africa, and that will lead to significant supply chain delays and could cause economic hardship. We'll see how the US Navy and its allies decide to handle this situation. Thus far, we've seen both Israel, the United States, and other European powers determine that this is a high priority area and dedicate assets to it. So we'll see what that looks like in the coming days and weeks, and we'll talk about that further. On to the next story. And this next story is disturbing. An investigation by 972 magazine and Local Call reveals that the Israeli army's expanded authorization for bombing non-military targets, the loosening of constraints regarding expected civilian casualties, and the use of artificial intelligence to generate more potential targets have contributed to the destructive nature of Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza. These factors have led to a staggering loss of human life, with over 300 families having lost 10 or more family members and over 15,000 Palestinians having been killed. This investigation is based on conversations with members of the IDF and the Israeli intelligence community, Palestinian testimonies, data, documentation, and official statements. Sites that serve as a value for both Hamas and Palestinian people but aren't distinctly military targets, like public buildings and infrastructure, private residences, and high-rises, are all called power targets. These targets are designated and struck to inflict pain on the Palestinian people, with the idea that the people will begin to apply pressure on Hamas to end the war. In other words, it's a strategic bombing campaign. And we've talked on this channel about strategic bombing campaigns and their effectiveness, and how historically they actually have the inverse effect of hardening the resolve of people. But what's disturbing about this report is how it reveals that the IDF is using AI for target generation and prosecution, all with relaxed constraints on mitigating civilian casualties. This has not only generated a significant amount of civilian casualties, but it's also contradicted previous policies by the IDF to protect civilians. The report notes that Israeli intelligence officials have wanted to create the image of victory since the October 7th attacks and the intelligence failures that led to those attacks. That said, we've discussed previously how this process will actually create the next war. And this is a statement echoed by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin discussing how Israel might be headed for a strategic defeat, which we don't often hear from US officials discussing allies walking towards a potential strategic defeat. But this is something we've talked about on this channel on previous videos, talking about how Israel targets the civilian population. They likely may succeed in destroying Hamas, but what they're really doing in the meantime is they're hardening the resolve of the people to just create another offshoot militant group to fight against Israel. And so really this war is just going to set the stage for the next one, whether in this generation or the next generation. Now, with all of that cheerful news being said, let's dive into comments from the last video. It really started to pop off, especially as I'm recording, and a lot of it looks like it's geared around the Venezuela news. So let's see what you all had to say. KLZ7618 said, hey, shout out, it's pronounced Essequibo. Yep, completely agree. I practiced it a few times before I hit record, and then the moment I hit record, it's like I didn't practice whatsoever and I mispronounced it completely. So that's completely on me. Shafale862 said, big fish eating little fish. And yes, I mean, Venezuela could be trying to eat the little fish, but at the same time, I think the war in Ukraine has shown that it's really a lot harder to eat the little fish than we thought. And so if Venezuela does decide to pursue an invasion, then it'll be interesting to see how Guayana holds out and really what the Brazilian response is, because there's bigger fish than Venezuela in the area as well. User, and then a long string of characters and numbers, said 90% of the people did not vote on the referendum. As you may see in the polls are almost empty. Maduro was forbidden to enter Guyana by the World Court by an order. Should Venezuela defy the order of the World Court, it would be sanctioned and all of its activities would also be ceased under the sanctions. Yes, this is true, but at the same time, we've seen that sanctions haven't really deterred Iran or Russia from pursuing their objectives, and so we might see expanded sanctions on Venezuela, but at the same time, it will really be a matter of time and really more forceful action to deter Venezuela. But again, that's just something we're gonna have to wait and see. And then Stuart Jones had a pretty good one. Hey, he's doing a Galtieri, and that's a good reference. If any of you you remember, that's the general in Argentina who took over Argentina and attempted to take the Falklands from the British. That did not work out too well. So hopefully he doesn't carry out fully the imitation of Galtieri and he just uses this for propaganda purposes. But hey, we'll find out. But with all of that being said, comment your thoughts and we'll talk about your comments on the next video. Like this video if you found it helpful and informative, and we will talk next time.